Married to my lovely wife, Lacey, and we live in Dutchess County, Rhinebeck, and are the proud parents of twin boys, identical twin boys. They're 4, turned 5 in August. They're a handful, Maxwell and Coltrane, and they start kindergarten in the fall, which is pretty exciting.
So you live in, you said you live in Rhinebeck?
Yeah.
So how long have you lived there for?
January of 2017.
Oh, okay. So originally I was seeing, about your story too. So you're originally from Schenectady?
Born and raised in Schenectady. Okay. Parents worked for GE for a very long time. We were working class folk. I remember growing up in pretty small apartments in the neighborhoods, being pretty tough. And then over time, though, we worked our way up into the middle class. Bought our first brand new home when I was a freshman in high school. And my wife, Lacey, grew up in Woodstock, 1 hour away from me. Both of our families, our parents, are alive and well and healthy and very empowered grandparents. Peggy, Lacey's mother, my mother-in-law, lives in Kingston, has owned a store called Town and Country Liquor there for over, I think, 30 plus years. The head of the Chamber of Commerce, her father, a local accountant in Kingston. My parents are now retired in Schenectady, so a lot of support, with the grandparents.
So, why did you decide to run for the 19th Congressional District?
A lot of it has to do with where I come from, and just thinking about what's happened over the span of my lifetime. So my wife and I are born the same year, same month, and I think we're a part of that last generation of young people who kind of grew up under that old economic model before globalization set in, before technology advanced to the point where you could invest in wealth and capital, not invest in people. And so, we lived it. We were able to stand on the backs of our families and on the values that we were raised on and go on and be successful. I'm now, or had been for a while, a litigator. Before that, I worked with young kids in the hip-hop space. My wife's a filmmaker. But we've seen trends in the wrong direction for families like the ones we come from, right? So for the past 40 plus years now, we've seen the economy double in size, but wages have gone absolutely nowhere. The GEs, the IBMs that were once in this area are no longer what they used to be. And our focus on education is not what it used to be. I remember growing up where when you had debates, particularly on the national level, you had, particularly as a Democrat, but you had to talk about your educational platform. We had 3 debates in 2016. There was not a single question about education. That's the great equalizer, the gateway to opportunity. It allowed me to go on to Colgate, become a Rhodes Scholar, go to Oxford, study philosophy and political theory, and then get my law degree at Harvard from pretty humble beginnings. And so it's important to never lose sight of that. So why am I running? Because that whole narrative, that the story of upward mobility, who we are and how we get there and the values that we stand upon are now under assault. And families have been left behind and they're hurting. And people have stopped believing in democracy because of it. And it's a scary reality. And it's one that I can't accept for my children in this world.
Oh, nice. So you mentioned your education briefly there. You said that, can you just say again, you said you went to Colgate?
I did. I went to Colgate. Love Colgate. Red Raiders, you got it. Division I basketball.
Yeah.
My freshman year, we played with the Donald Foyle. Yeah, I was. We went to the tournament. We were a 16th seed, and we got beat pretty badly by UConn. They had a guy named Ray Allen on the team. It was fun though, and actually just got inducted into the Upstate Basketball Hall of Fame not long ago. So that was exciting. Studied philosophy and political theory. That was my passion. My first passion was basketball growing up. My second passion was philosophy, and studied that at Colgate and then studied it at Oxford as a graduate student.
And then you said you graduated from Harvard Law?
Yes, got my law degree at Harvard, and that's where I met my wife, who went to Kingston High School and Georgetown undergrad.
How long have you guys? How long have you been married for?
Since September 2011.
Okay.
Now, we first met, though, when I was in my first year of law school, so 2002.
Oh, okay. You were a while then.
Yes, and she was a third-year law student. I was a first-year law student. And we went to it was the first meeting for some organization, and she stood up to give a presentation. And I knew right away. That's in fact, a friend of mine who we're still friends with to this day tells a story that I leaned over to him and said, "That's going to be my wife." So, we dated briefly, and then she was a couple years older than me, so she graduated, and I stayed behind and kept going, and then we kept in touch. And then you fast forward 8 years later, we reconnected in 2010.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That is cool.
Right. Meant to be,
Yeah.
it's meant to be.
That's what I tell her
Awesome.
all the time.
Right.
Meant to be.
Yeah. So you talked about what you were doing. You said you were a litigator.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that what you still, or I don't know, maybe you're campaigning full time. I don't know if you still do that. But what were you doing leading up to this, or if you still do it, your occupation?
So after law school, I went to LA and started my own independent music company. It was a decision that was not a traditional one. Coming out of law school, I did not practice. I actually spent 4 or 5 years working with young kids, trying to figure out how to use hip-hop culture to get them more civically engaged. Then I moved back to New York and started my family with my wife, with Lacey, and started working as a litigator at a law firm. And in that space, I started there in 2011 and worked until about July of 2017. Part of my decision to come back home, part of our decision, my wife and I's decision for us to return home after the Trump election, had a lot to do with beginning anew, leaving a sort of lifestyle behind and recommitting to service in the way that I had coming out of law school. I loved my time at Aiken Gump, but it had run its course. And I felt compelled to action. So I left the firm, and I'm no longer working at the firm, and that was as of July 2017. So when folks say, "What am I doing now?" I mean, this is my job, full time. And if I plan on winning, but in the end, if I don't win, what's exciting about this is that I can begin anew and continue to figure out how I can serve.
So what has been the? I saw your ad too. I saw there's a lot of platforms I guess you've been running on, but is there a certain one that you feel is most important issue? That you've.
Healthcare.
Okay.
Let me back up a little bit, because no matter the issue, what matters most to me, and I think what's lacking in our politics, is integrity and decency and a commitment to solutions. It's very partisan, it's ugly, and I'd argue immoral at times. And that to me is what the driving mechanism is for my decision to do this, is this notion that it is very unstable right now, and that we have lost all semblance of community, of compassion, of love in our politics. So that's, until we restore that piece of it, then all the other discussions on policy are going to continue to be that we're never going to have any real communication or real dialogue. But on the question of healthcare, we're talking about probably the most important issue as I've traveled across this district and spoken with the constituents and voters and members of the community, because we're talking about something that people rely on as a matter of life and death, and economically. Hospitals are the biggest employers in the district. So, and you have rural access issues in much of the district, and you have the raging opioid epidemic in this district. So there's so many issues that kind of flow out of the healthcare dynamic. And on top of that, we have a congressman in John Faso who literally voted to take away healthcare from thousands of folks in his own district, his own constituents, after promising to not defund Planned Parenthood, and after promising Andrea Mitchell on camera that he would not take away her health care. So to me, not only is this an important issue, independent of the current congressman, but we actually have a congressman who's only making it worse. And so it's important that we really work hard to no longer be the only developed country in the world, without some form of universal health care. That is a travesty to me. It's a crime in and of itself. We're the richest country in the world's history. Whether it's single payer, whether it's a public option, you name we don't have any kind of form whatsoever. The only developed country in the world. On top of that, Medicare can't negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. That is a crime in and of itself. And so to me, making sure we make those transformative changes to our healthcare system, get the profit motive out of our system, is critically important.
So if you were elected, what would you want to, or how do you plan to address that issue?
Well, I think the way to address it, first and foremost, is to figure out what we can pass, right? What actually can we achieve to really alter the course of where we're headed on this issue. We have currently folks in Congress who are determined to repeal the ACA and roll back every bit of gains. And if they can't repeal it, we have a guy, a president in Trump, who's literally single-handedly trying to undermine it through various actions. That's what's at stake. So, one, we have to make sure we continue to maintain what we have and fight to do so. And two, we have to figure out how can we advance the ball toward a system of Medicare for all. How do we do it? How do we actually move in a direction that takes the profit motive out of healthcare? To me, an achievable, critical step, first step that I think can really accomplish something is a public option. Giving folks choice to opt into Medicare does a couple of things. One, it allows folks who want to keep their healthcare, who like their healthcare, but aren't comfortable with the idea just yet of going from a private market insurance-based system that they can rely on to a totally government-run system, but they do want us to move in the right direction towards universal health care. They can say, okay, we'll get behind this movement, we'll be a part of this movement and see how it goes. But two, it also allows folks who are healthy, people who aren't high risk, to opt in to Medicare, which is otherwise a high-risk pool. That'll drive down premiums, drive down deductibles, and what you'll see by virtue of that fact is the entire cost of healthcare go down considerably. Never mind the fact that you also have the private market itself right now, which has a monopoly on the premiums and deductibles. So once you have a public competitor, it can set the floor in the marketplace, and that'll make sure that at the very least we have something to tether the private market to. Right now, they're doing whatever they want to do at our expense. And then the other piece, which I think many folks know at this point, is that prescription drug costs are the highest drivers of costs in our healthcare system. And the chief reason for that is Medicare not being able to negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. Another big piece of this is the prescription drugs stranglehold on our regulatory framework, so much so that they can literally pay generic brand companies to shelve their products so they can keep jacking up the price on their end. And that's legal under our current system of law because it was lobbied for by Big Pharma. So these are the things that we can focus on that'll have a profound effect on folks all across this district and the country for that matter.
So you say you're for Medicare for all, so do you support, I know there are two bills kind of right now that are
no, let me be clear. I am for fighting toward a Medicare for all system.
Okay.
And I think a critical step in that direction, a critical first step in that direction is allowing folks to opt in to Medicare. That to me is a critical. There is no piece of legislation that I have seen as of right now that I'm comfortable with that is a literally complete alteration of our healthcare system at this point. I don't see a system like that. Now we've seen it in states where there have been attempts to do so. Vermont, right? We saw what happened there. The state went bankrupt. California had it on its ballot. And I think part of the reason why it failed to pass in California was because they hadn't flushed out how, the administrative costs, the timeline. It just was sort of a principle on paper, but there was no meat on the bone. And we need meat on the bone if we want to pass legislation of this magnitude, of this consequence. And I think we can begin to put that meat on the bone by taking steps that actually get us there over time.
So you don't support like the Bernie Sanders bill in there
right now, that's a good example. Okay. Right, that does not have enough meat on the bone.
Gotcha. Okay. You want to pause in the conversation? Anybody have some questions? Yeah.
No, you continue. Go ahead.
Okay. So how about the issue with gun violence, the conversation happening right now. I guess the conversation is more among residents here.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, what I really appreciate what's happened the last several months has a lot to do with what young people have done. Young people, by standing up and really voicing their opinion on this, have, in essence, almost depoliticized it and made it about what's right and what's wrong, and put a lot of pressure on the adults in the room to do right by them, because it's insane that young people have to worry about mass shootings while learning, and it's very frustrating. And it's also quite unfortunate that we have political leaders who deem the appropriate solution to be to arm teachers. That is not a smart idea either. What we have seen, I think, for too long is this conversation get framed around taking people's guns away or controlling one's access to guns per se. The way that it should be framed, and I think you've hit on this, is we have an epidemic. And the epidemic is gun violence. The fact of the matter is 9 kids a day are dying from gun violence. 18 to 19 are being hospitalized a day. Women are 5 times more likely to die in a domestic violence dispute when a gun is involved. The countless mass shootings. When you start to look at the extent of this problem and frame it from that perspective and say, why aren't we doing anything to fix it? The answer is pretty simple. There's the NRA. And the NRA has made it a point to make sure that the most common sense pieces of legislation that has broad consensus across the board, can't even get its way to the floor. Take, for example, the bump stock and what happened in Las Vegas. I couldn't find a person that said the bump stock should be legal after that atrocity and that tragedy. Nevertheless, was there a bill on the floor? Never happened. There was a discussion about it for a couple of days, and then it just sort of magically disappeared. It disappeared because the NRA made it disappear. And there are folks in Congress who are bought and paid for by the NRA to do just that. And John Faso is one of those individuals, unfortunately. So to me, there are a host of things we can talk about and accomplish. Universal background checks, banning things like the bump stock, safe storage rules, funding the CDC to study gun violence, making sure we keep weapons of war off our streets and churches and out of theaters. These are things that have upwards of 80 to 90% agreement across party lines here. But the reason we can't get it done is because we keep putting people in places of power that aren't there for the right reasons. In my mind, the gun violence issue, there's no better example of how broken our system actually is. Because if you look at the polling on this and just people's point of view on this, the vast majority of folks want something done. And we can't get anything done. And as a person who comes from a family where we have hunters, and I used to go visit my uncle out in Rochester, he'd hunt all the time. My father-in-law is a treasurer of his gun club. I respect the Second Amendment right, and I'm here to protect that right. And I know that there are countless responsible gun owners all throughout this district, and there are valid reasons for owning a gun. And all the folks that I've talked to who are gun owners share the same point of view that I do on this. Once you get past the sort of noise that we get from outside folks and just talk about the issue at hand here and what the real concern is, protecting our communities, I think there's a lot of common ground.
So it was a state law, but you're running in this state, so I'm going to ask it anyway. Your view on the safe act, was that an overreach? Is that consistent with what you believe in? Right.
So I feel like the Safe Act came on the heels of one of the most difficult and tragic shootings this country has ever had to endure. And I think there was a lot of emotion in the way that bill was legislated. And I think it was rushed, and I think it was hurried. And I think as a result, there were arbitrary outcomes that came out of that bill that I think ultimately undermined the objective in the first place and created divisions where it need not. So I understand and agree with the motivation, right, in that movement. But I think that there could have been a better way to facilitate the bill and make sure that all the stakeholders were involved and had a voice in the process. And because that was not the case, I think it led to problematic outcomes.
I mean, we could stick with the state. I mean, I'll ask the obvious, since we're on the state kind of question again. I realize you're running federal, but your view on the New York governor's race. Do you endorse the candidate?
I have not endorsed a candidate, and to be honest with you, I haven't given it a lot of thought. I spent a lot of my time, on the road, connecting with voters, talking. I haven't met Cuomo, I haven't met Nixon. I haven't talked to them. I'd imagine at some point I will have to educate myself more and more on this issue, but I'm not there yet.
It's early still, so yeah.
What are some specific things in the SAFE Act that we're talking about that you think didn't meet the mark?
So you're talking about, for example, what constitutes the amount of rounds you can load in a magazine, for example, and just sort of this, they had to make the arbitrary decision essentially to cut it off at a certain level and say, well, there was no thought put into it. It was just sort of, well, we got to figure out something now. And they did it, right? So, and that kind of mistake leads to a moment where folks can jump on that, and then it just gets, you kind of lose the import in the beginning, right? And so it just has to be a more thoughtful approach to these types of decisions, particularly when you're talking about people's rights. And so that's one of the areas. And I also think that there need to be a little bit more thought about access or the privacy component between a patient and a physician, and sort of the access that the act is requiring the state to have by virtue. I wasn't necessarily. I wasn't sure that was the right thing to do. And then the third piece of this would be the disproportionate effect the law would have on certain communities as well, with the draconian sort of increased penalty on gun possession. I think the way it was framed, again, didn't have enough foresight in thinking about how it would impact certain communities.
How about immigration? What do you stand on that, and what do you think needs to be done?
Well, first of all, we're a nation of immigrants, and I think unfortunately, some of our most powerful leaders have forgotten that fact, and the rhetoric on this is beyond the pale. The notion that we have resorted to calling folks rapists and criminals and animals is incredibly disheartening and antithetical to who we are, I'd argue, as a country. We are, I argue, great because of our open-armed approach to the world. And so the fact that we're talking about building walls and pulling out of agreements and essentially isolating ourselves from the rest of the world is I've never felt so removed from what I've come to know as America's identity over the course of my lifetime. And there's no better example of this than how we talk about immigration in this country and how the folks in D.C., in particular Trump, talks about this. But Faso is to blame on this issue as well. He just sent out a mailer, where he talks about Cuomo handcuffing, law enforcement when in suggesting he should be handcuffing, undocumented immigrants, playing into the xenophobia that I just can't tolerate and will not tolerate. I think that a couple of issues. One, the DACA bill. The Dreamers. We need a clean bill, period, full stop. It should not be made contingent upon building a wall, should not be made contingent upon rolling back immigration provisions. That is a separate issue. And it really was disturbing to me that in the State of the Union, Trump made the statement, all Americans are dreamers, instead of saying all dreamers are Americans. I thought that was a backslap, and it was something that wasn't a real leader shouldn't have said. I think on the question of immigration, we've got to come together on this issue and really tease out a concrete, tangible, humane, compassionate, thoughtful path to citizenship, whereby folks can know, first and foremost, what they need to do to work here legally. And then once they do that, they can do so for a period of time, and then we can set the parameters upon which, over that course of period of time, they can become citizens. We have to work that out. And it's important to do so, not just for the standpoint of the moral imperative, but economically. Economically, there are too many industries that are relying on undocumented labor. And until we actually tease this out, they're relying on that undocumented labor at great risk because in a moment's notice, that labor force could be removed due to an ICE raid now because of Trump's unhinged mindset on this issue.
So, for people who are undocumented immigrants, clearly you're saying that you don't agree with. I guess because they're not, since they're not documented. I mean, how do we address that problem? Because that can. I know that there are laws about legally being here or not. I know, and that's that side's argument. Because I know the Clean DACA bill is one side for the children, but what about their parents?
Yeah, that's why it's appropriate to start figuring out what the legal parameters are. And when people say path, what I take that to mean, or what I mean by path, is that we actually begin to lay out the steps that one who is currently undocumented can take to work here legally, be here, reside here legally, and ultimately and over time, under a certain, whether it's length of time, education, whatever, we can map out the different conditions, but over time, become a citizen. Right now, there's no clear path. There's temporary work programs that allow certain folks to work here in certain industries, which in and of themselves, at times can be exploitative. So that's a problem too. So again, really focusing on what that path ought to look like, and that is going to take bipartisan support. This has to be a situation where the parties come together. Well, I'd argue all issues are like this, but we've got to come together on this and figure out what that path needs to look like. Really do the work that people are sending us there to do, and figure out a problem here. And that problem is the fact that we, first and foremost, are just not addressing something that has a profound effect and a significant effect on our economy, and on top of that, is forcing us to have these conversations that are leading to rhetoric that is incredibly cruel and ugly.
Do you guys have anything, Ray? Do you have anything?
What about tariffs?
Yes.
We're seeing exactly what Trump's opponents warned him about.
Yeah.
The tariff war. We have ours. Now Mexico was getting involved.
Yeah. So here's what's from my perspective. You have there's a kernel of truth when Trump talks about what has happened to the American worker by virtue of some of the trade agreements that we entered into, dating back to the 90s. Because there was, in fact, as the world got big, and I spoke about this in my own story, right, and how I grew up pre-globalization. And once the world got big and once the world market opened up, and you can actually go out there and really kind of plant your flag economically in other parts of the world and invest in those parts of the world, there was a sort of race to the bottom. And the folks who had the means and who had the wealth went for it, and who suffered as a result? American workers. Because there was no effort by our government to say, wait a second, if you're going to go out there, the owners of wealth and capital and make these deals and use the government's power and faith and credit to make these deals or these agreements to lay the groundwork for you, well, you better make sure that there's something that comes back to the worker. But that never happened. And so workers have been left behind for a very long time. And so when Trump talks about this reality, there's truth there. The problem, he's identified the problem, but his solution is about as reckless as it could possibly be. The way you try to rectify this situation is to not unilaterally and publicly disparage your allies, folks who stand with you and have stood with you for decades. You don't just start, saying things publicly in a manner that undermines the relationship. And not only does that affect one's ability to negotiate potentially a better deal amongst the folk that you're in the process of negotiating with, it also inhibits your ability later on to negotiate deals with the work of your allies when it comes to China and when it comes to Russia, because now you've totally isolated yourself from the entire world. And so his behavior, his treatment, and how he's going about doing this, I don't find very productive. And so it's unfortunate that having identified the problem, the solution that he's now implementing is only making it worse. It's not rectifying the situation.
How about locally? In the district, what would you say are the key issues? I mean, obviously, all these are key issues for the nation, but here, what do you think?
So one of the things that we have not discussed, I mean, healthcare, I think, is a major local issue. The opioid epidemic is a major issue across the district, and decriminalizing that behavior, funding the drug treatment centers is critical. Holding the pharmaceutical companies accountable for essentially giving these drugs away, despite knowing that they were highly addictive. That's a big issue. But the piece that we haven't talked about that I think really implicates the 19th Congressional District, the Hudson Valley Catskills, is how we create jobs. How do we create stability here economically? And we haven't had that stability for a very long time because there hasn't been an anchor company here like GE or IBM for a very long time. And we've been waiting and waiting, and nothing's really come up behind. And there's an opportunity for responsible, thoughtful government to incentivize growth. And the big way to do that, and Trump actually ran a platform, or his platform included this, will be an infrastructure bill. He proposed in his campaign $1 trillion infrastructure bill, $1 trillion. That is actually a very appropriate policy. One, we need the infrastructure. We haven't upgraded the software, if you will, of our country, for a very long time. We're still operating on 20th century modes of travel, whether it's road, rail, or subways, or you name it. And then, of course, you got places right here in the Hudson Valley and the Catskills that don't have broadband access, that don't have quality cell service. So we could, as a government, make sure that we build the towers. We employ folks to build towers here so folks have quality cell service, make sure we have broadband access. And now what that does is, in the first instance, create actual jobs, but it also incentivizes economic investment. Because right now, people are not going to want to do work or set up business in an area that doesn't have good cell service or doesn't have broadband access, because they're going to be at a disadvantage relative to other parts of the country or the state for that matter. And so making sure that we double down on infrastructure is a critical piece. Similarly, moving away from the fossil fuel industry to the renewable energy space is a critical step. Not only because of how beautiful and majestic the Hudson Valley and the Catskills are and how we thrive off, that's part of our identity. Clean air, clean water are very important in dealing with the problem of climate change. But also, again, job creation. There are an abundance of jobs in the renewable energy space that we can't tap into right now because we're too busy propping up big oil and not thinking about how to incentivize investment in wind, and solar, and geothermal. 17 times the rate right now. That's what solar is growing at compared to the overall economy. So there's opportunities there. Workforce development, another big piece. We don't have any training right now. We're not funding training to make sure that our workforce is able to take on the jobs that are available to them. And then lastly, education. What I've heard across this district are failing schools. Schools are not properly funded, and a curriculum that does not prepare our young people in a comprehensive fashion. Does not provide them with the skill set that they need, even hard skills that they might need should they choose not to go to college. We're not talking about vocational schools anymore, apprenticeship programs, trade schools. We're not doing any of that stuff anymore. And on top of that, we're not preparing our kids, our young people, to be citizens. Courses like civics have been thrown to the wayside because of budget cuts. And that's a problem because it undermines our sense of community. It undermines our ability to be civically engaged. And as a result, the folks who want to keep this situation exactly as it is benefit. And those of us who are left behind continue to suffer.
So you're saying you would, you said, for example, you would double down on infrastructure. You mean so there would be...
Public works, robust public works infrastructure. And you know where that $1 trillion went? Instead of to the infrastructure, it went to the deficit when we did the tax scam. That was the trade-off. Trump gave it away in that tax bill that literally is on the backs of working and middle-class folks and on the backs of New Yorkers, for that matter, due to the SALT deduction being impacted. On top of that, They rolled back the mandate, right? So that's going to drive up premiums and deductibles. So it's a double whammy here. And it really has limited our ability to do a host of things. And instead, we're hearing arguments from the right about having to cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. This is not the direction we ought to be going in. We have to be fortifying those programs, not seeking to undermine them.
The last time I looked at a Trump proposal for infrastructure, a lot of that was investment from individual or private companies and the state and localities.
Yep.
So you're proposing more federal spending.
Yes, great point. So when Trump ran, here's the timeline of Trump's infrastructure bill. Okay, when he ran on a $1 trillion public-based infrastructure bill. Then he got elected, and it became a $200 billion federally funded infrastructure bill that he thought would incentivize state and local private investment. So another $800 billion of just private local incentivization based on that $200 billion, which is a hoax. It's a hope. It's not a plan at all. And then ultimately, the spending bill we got resulted in $23 billion for the entire country for infrastructure. So that is the timeline that we have. And so to your question, yes, I'm talking about a robust public works-based infrastructure bill that speaks to the needs of the public, the community. It's not about green lighting projects that have already been underway for some time and doing personal favors for certain friends and folks who say, hey, under the guise of this infrastructure bill, can you turn the lights on in this building over here? Can you get this casino up over here? No, that's not infrastructure bill we're talking about. We're talking about really investing in the community again, whether it's schools, libraries, community centers, bridges, road, rail. These are the things that we have to really double down on to make sure folks have a way forward again.
Is there going to be a blue wave this fall? Or do you think Trump has got, polling numbers say that the people that elected him still support him greatly?
Here's what I know, because I don't have a crystal ball. But what I do know is that the level of engagement, at least across the Hudson Valley and the Catskills and all throughout the 19th District, up to the Capital Region and down to the Southern Tier, is electric. People are activated in a way that I haven't seen in a very long time. And I think that bodes very well because I think the reason why, for Democrats, because I think the reason why people are activated and mobilized right now is a reaction to the rhetoric, the ugliness, the cruelty, the immorality coming out of the politics, specifically the Republican-controlled Congress, and a president who was morally bankrupt. And I think that is what people are reacting to. And so if that is the case, one would suspect that we will see something significant happen in 2018. That being said, I really have tried to focus, and I have focused on making sure that whatever happens in the national landscape, at least the folks right here at home get the change that they deserve and get true accountable representation, and not just for Democrats, Republicans, independents, by virtue of being Americans and by virtue of living in a democracy.
So now let's fast forward. It's January 1st, 2019. You made it through the primary. You're elected.
Yes.
The president that is called morally bankrupt can he pardon himself, or is impeachment a reality?
Yeah, so that's actually a question, a legal question that at this point is hard to. There's not a lot of precedent on that. Just like there's not a lot of precedent for a president who, attempts to position himself above the law publicly too, just outright. Here's what I know. I know that the Russians, as concluded by all of our intelligence agencies, meddled in our election for the purpose of electing Trump. Those are facts. And I also know that, Trump took a very long time to acknowledge that fact, and I'm not sure he still has fully acknowledged that fact. I also know that there have been a series of other acts, be them by him or by his team, that are concerning and seem to not be consistent with letting the investigation unfold in a way that allows us as Americans to get to the very bottom of what the Russians have done and how to prevent it from happening again in the future. In fact, we're currently, at this point, under attack. Nothing's been done to stop it, and we've been informed not long ago that the attack is ongoing. So, but nothing has happened. That being said, we have an investigation underway, and that investigation needs to conclude before we just jump the gun here and move towards action that I don't think at this point is responsible. I think we have to make sure we let things unfold all the way through. Let Mueller conclude his investigation. And on that note, I would say that it's imperative that we pass legislation that protects Mueller. The fact of the matter is, we do have that legislation, and I don't hear Faso calling for it when he should be. He should be on the front lines saying that this is something that we need to make sure we protect for the integrity of the investigation, for the integrity of our democracy. I think that's a critical piece as well.
We haven't talked about international affairs yet, so what about your hopes for what's going to happen next week with North Korea?
Well, stepping back and just talking through a little bit about the meeting itself, you hope for the best. You want the best outcome possible. That being said, how we got here is uncomfortable and is unclear, and does not reflect any sort of coherent theory. It just sort of seemed to happen ad hocly, without any, not in a way that I think is constructive. And the fact that we had starts and fits, and we had the meeting that didn't have the meeting, it's unsettling, if you will. Now, that being said, big picture, we're dealing with probably our gravest threat in terms of the safety of the country and the security of the country. North Korea, does have the capacity to cause a lot of destruction and mayhem right across its own borders with South Korea in the event that we don't act smart and do so responsibly. So trying to figure out how to take actions in a way that can lead to a more peaceful outcome are imperative, given the gravity of the danger. So we'll see the steps that happen. It's not customary for the leaders of the world to meet prior to an agreement actually happening. Usually that happens at the conclusion of an agreement to sort of fortify it. So there's a lot of unorthodoxy that is happening right now, which makes it hard to read where this is going. But obviously you want the outcome that benefits the world here. And the outcome that benefits the world is a solution that leads to peace.
Going back to the race, actually, that you're in right now, so 7 of you, I believe, right?
Yes, there's 7 of us.
What do you feel makes you stand out from everybody else?
Well, I think one of the things that folks want to know is, can you beat John Faso? Right? That's kind of what matters. I will say that there's not a lot of daylight when it comes to the policies. There's a little bit of daylight, but ultimately, you really want to make sure you have an advocate who can represent your values and who can take it to John Faso and win, and then be a true representative once in Congress. That to me means that the candidate has to be able to do everything you need that candidate to do, and do it very well. So what does that mean? Well, that means, one, you need a candidate who can work really hard, harder than anybody else, including John Faso. And I think my roots, coming from a working class family, being told when I was yay high to work twice as hard, that's how I've lived my life from day one, and it's proven to be successful. And I intend to take that, and I have taken that same work ethic to this process, and that's the reason why I've been able to do things in other areas that also make me formidable and able to beat John Faso, like raise money. This is a district where $18 million was spent on it in 2016. $18 million. There are 4 media markets, one of which is New York City. John Faso was backed by the Mercer family, as well as the Republican machinery. So to act as if resources are not necessary to take on that kind of onslaught is not realistic. And I'm happy to say that because of the work ethic that I brought to bear, along with my wife, her work ethic, I'm the only candidate that's been able to actually outraise John Faso every quarter of 2017. We've raised more than $2 million. And none of that has come from a corporate PAC. That comes from people, individuals in the community who understand what we're about. And that's an important piece. And we've used those resources to build, I'd argue, a phenomenal organization that reaches all across this district, end to end. Whether it's the petitioning period where we almost had 6,000 signatures to get on the ballot, more than any other candidate by far, whether it's the only county-wide endorsement in Dutchess County, whether it's our most recent endorsement from Citizen Action, which was a huge boost to our support, whether it's the fact that we were the first on TV and in mailboxes. We've always continued to be out front on all the critical objective metrics for a successful campaign operation. And then you bring all that together with, I think, an approach that we need now, which is to inspire folks, inspire turnout. And I think this is one of my skill sets that is unique to me. I think that I have the ability, given my set of experiences over the course of my life, to speak to people's hearts and minds and to give them a sense of what's possible when people actually buy into our democracy again and rally around our shared values. And that is what I'm able to do, I think, significantly better than the rest of the field. And so you bring all those things together and you're looking at a campaign that can decisively beat John Faso. And if you want a candidate who can beat John Faso, well, then I think I'm that candidate.
How do you get big money and special interests out of our democracy?
Yes. So this is another great point. No one should ever confuse the fact that I've worked my tail off to raise a lot of money to compete in this system with the viewpoint that I like money in the system. I don't want money in the system. I want it out. I want to overturn Citizens United. I want publicly financed campaigns. I think that given the level of inequality we have in our country, it is undermining our democracy. Think of it like this. 80% of folks right now are sharing 10% of the wealth. 80%. Last year, the top 10% captured more than 75% of all the income, all of it. So if the way we move our democracy is, unfortunately, to pay for it, to get access is to pay for it, and only a handful of folks in the entire country actually have the resources to pay for that access, that's not a democracy after a while. That's an oligarchy, right? The vast majority of folks have been shut out, have been barricaded out of the system. They have no visibility, no impact on what their representation does on their behalf. And that is a problem. And so the more we can allow unlimited amounts of money to dump into the system, all that does is just allow those with power to continue to dictate the terms through their wealth, to dictate the terms of the national discourse and the issues we talk about. And it's profoundly disturbing because that's not democratic in any way, shape, or form. We call ourselves a democracy, but that is not how a democracy works.
Was the legal argument that would overturn Citizens United?
Well, it wouldn't be. It would have to be an amendment through Congress. I mean, the fact of the matter is, legally, we have a legal fallacy which, views corporations as people, which is a problem. But it's become precedent, and it's a part of our legal jurisprudence, right? And so, how you deal with that in the legal side of things or in the judicial space is very difficult once it's been laid in as precedent. But Congress can take steps, significant step, although it would take a significant effort and a collective effort on the part of Congress, I think 2/3, to actually amend it and overturn it. But it would take that kind of effort. But even before that, right? Even before that, there are things we can do, to make sure that we at least mitigate the reality that we're limited to right now.
Anything else?
We have a lot of veterans in this district, and there's a proposal out there by their advocates, their supporters, to legalize marijuana so they can use that for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I am for legalizing marijuana for medicinal purposes, and I'd argue that if properly regulated for recreational purposes. Not only do I not see any real issues with it from a sort of a health standpoint, but also I think once legalized, it could have an incredible economic impact. The amount of revenue that might be generated from that could do a lot of good. And on top of that, we got way too many folks incarcerated under a legal system that has made it illegal to possess marijuana. And one of the great tragedies is now we got folks in states that have legalized marijuana, but there are folks serving jail time still for selling marijuana or just possessing marijuana. That in and of itself is a crime, in my opinion. So, we've got to make sure we work on this issue and stop being so hypocritical about it. So yes, I'm a proponent of that.
Are there any areas of commonality that you would say if you met a Trump voter, to appeal to them?
Yes, absolutely. So I was just at a diner. We're doing a diner tour across the district, and we were in Saugerties at the diner, and there's a gentleman who was sitting in the front, and we were there for about an hour and a half. About 25 folks were there, and he was listening pretty intently. And at the end of the hour or so, after taking a bunch of questions, he rose his hand and he said, "I want to say something." And I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "I voted for Obama twice." And his wife was sitting next to him, and she goes, "Yeah," and he had a poster and everything, right? And so, and he goes, "But then I voted for Trump." And the room, was kind of like, "Oh, okay, it's interesting." And he said, "I'm not really going to get into all the reasons why." He was like, "But I'm going to tell you why I want to vote for you and why I will vote for you." And this is where the commonality is. He said, "When you speak to me, I feel like you're actually speaking to me, that you care about me, that you genuinely want to help me. You're not talking past me, you're really engaging me, that you're here to do your job, be accountable, and you're fair. And you're not going to cut the line, you're not going to cheat your way in, you're just going to do your job and do it in a way that is about me. And you sound like you're speaking from the heart. You sound like you say what you mean what you say. You sound authentic." And I think when you look at what some of Trump's appeal is, you have to contrast it against what's been lacking in our politics. And what's been lacking in our politics for a very long time is authenticity. And even if someone's rhetoric and the way they speak is ugly and cruel, if it at the least reflects a place that seems to come from, at least on the surface, a place of what they believe, and is not filtered or not manufactured or scripted, but just is what it is, when you contrast that against the other side, which has struggled for a little too long to speak plainly, to speak candidly about issues that matter to them and not worry about how someone might react to them, and just say, "Here's what I believe." People want that. And I think That's what people are looking for right now. And I feel like that's what I try to bring to bear. When I go home to my parents and I talk to them and about, what I've seen or not seen, I was raised to speak frankly, and be blunt and not pull punches and just say what you say and mean it. And I think there's too much cuteness right now in our politics. And I think that people are tired of that. And I think that's an important piece. The other piece is respect. I was in Sullivan County at a bagel fest, and a gentleman came into a Democratic committee tent where I was sitting, and he asked the question, "Who are you?" And somebody said he's running for Congress against John Faso. He said, "Well, what about Trump? Trump brought back, hundreds of jobs last quarter. What do you got to say about that?" And I said, "Well, I'm not running against Trump. I'm running against John Faso. What do you know about him?" And he said, "Well, I don't really know John Faso, so who cares?" And I say, "Well, John Faso voted to take away your health care. A lot of folks would have been impacted by that vote. Don't you care about that?" And he said, "Well, yeah, but, a lot of folks who are in nice cars and who wear gold teeth, they're on Medicaid. There's a lot of fraud in Medicaid." And I said to him, "Well, can we just put that aside for a second? And I'm not sure I agree with that, but just for the sake of this conversation, let's put that aside and just talk about the folks who we know legitimately need it, who really need it, life or death. Take them off the healthcare rolls as well? Just kick them off?" "No, of course not. I wouldn't do that." I said, "Great, we're in agreement." He shook hands, he laughed, and he walked out of the room, and everybody kind of had a nice moment. Now, I kept going about my business. 15, 20 minutes later, I'm walking down eating a bagel still, and I feel a tap on my shoulder. It's the same guy. He tracked me down. I turn around, he says to me, "Hey, man, I like you. You keep fighting." Now, the lesson there was not that we found some common ground on the issues, right? The lesson there was I sought common ground with him as a human being and said, "Okay, we might not agree, but I'm going to talk to you like a person. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to rush to judgment based on what you say. I'm going to listen, and we're going to engage, and we're going to have a moment grounded in our shared humanity and in decency." And I think he walked away from that, felt it, and felt compelled to come back and make sure that I understood that he did feel that. And it's going to take that kind of work. Being out there, being humble, making oneself vulnerable, and engaging with folks. That's what service, I think, ought to be, particularly in the public arena.
The question I'd ask is polling. Where are you?
Yeah, we're doing well. People talk about our campaign as the campaign to beat. And I think that's a fairly accurate assessment. I think that we've worked very hard to build an organization, raise the resources, build a volunteer staff and groups, and have really, I think, emerged as the best organized, most resourceful campaign in the field. And we have, due to another Democratic candidate, the privilege of being able to cite to a poll that we didn't have to pay for that shows that I'm also in the dead heat with John Faso. So that's nice too. So not only do we feel very good about where we are situated in the primary, but I feel very good about what we can do once we get through the primary in unseating John Faso.